Sure, war is awful. The fighters die. Sadly, civilian people die as well. And that's just totally bad. When aid workers die, they're there to help the people who are suffering. It just seems doubly, triply bad. There appears to be a strike, a targeted strike by Israel, and a number of aid workers lost their lives. How could that possibly happen?
Foreign aid workers carried out of Gaza after those Israeli airstrikes on vehicles marked with large World Central Kitchen logos.
Some of the people that died were my friends, and I served with them.
The founder of the aid group, Chef Jose Andres, appearing on Israeli television and demanding answers.
They were targeted systematically, car by car. So this was not just a bad luck situation where, we dropped the bomb in the wrong place, or no. This was over 1.5, 1.8 kilometers with a very defined humanitarian convoy.
It's worth setting some context to this, I think. There's no shortage of aid from the international community to help in Gaza. The challenge is getting it into Gaza itself. For whatever reason, Israel's been reluctant to let it flow freely through the land route. The airdrops we've seen are not targeted. They've been hurting people on the ground, and you can't do a fraction of the aid required. What's happening is an interim measure before the big ships arrive, and the Mulberry Harbour that America's building is that there's been vessels coming backwards and forwards from Cyprus onto a temporary pier, offloading aid, and there's been aid organisations like the World Central Kitchen who've been taking that aid and distributing it. The news, as it was reported earlier on this week, was that the a convoy of aid workers was delivering aid, and they got targeted. What it actually turned out was that this was the end of their shift. They'd finished delivering aid. 3 vehicles, 2 armoured vehicles and 1 soft-skin vehicle, transporting 6 workers, but driven by at least 1 Palestinian driver, were heading back from central Gaza, where their headquarters was, back to Rafah, where they were living. They were going along the coast road on the way out, which is about the most rural area, so it's away from the built-up areas, apparently a regular route. They had apparently been deconflicted with the Israeli Defense Forces, that they knew they were there. But on that fateful night, 6 aid workers were killed. John Chapman, James Henderson and James Kilby, 3 Brits, passed away. There was a bit of talk about, they were in their uniforms, their aid workers' uniforms, and they were in a car with aid worker logos. But it was nighttime, so none of that would have been very visible, but it was a tragic death. Worth also pointing out that this story has come to our attention because of 3 Brits, tragic deaths for those. But it's worth pointing out there are 196 Palestinian aid workers that have been killed since the start of this conflict. So this is not a one-off. This is it's a very dangerous occupation in Gaza at the moment.
But are you saying, because of your previous comment about Israel reluctant to let aid go through, are you saying, therefore, they would directly target aid workers to stop aid getting through? Or
what I'm saying is that there's been a lot of speculation about how on earth this incident could have happened. First of all, Prime Minister Netanyahu has been very quick to admit that it was the Israeli Defense Forces made a dreadful mistake in the singular term, and also that this was the strike singular was a mistake. When you look at the evidence on the ground, and the open source intelligence team, particularly at Sky, have done an outstanding job of doing this, tracking that there were the 3 vehicles that would have started off in a convoy have actually ended up nearly 2.5 kilometers apart. The first vehicle that's been destroyed was an armoured vehicle and has suffered a significant amount of damage. The second vehicle, I hope we've got a picture of it, is a white vehicle with a big hole in the roof. But interestingly, none of the windows have been blown out. And now that's an armoured vehicle, would have armoured glass in, but even so, you'd expect more damage. And inside, it doesn't look like something's blown up. So that looks sort of survivable. The third car is at least another kilometre down the road, and that's been completely destroyed. And the news suggested that all of these 6 people, plus the Palestinian driver, had all died in one vehicle. Now, if you join the dots up of that, it doesn't look like it's an airstrike from a fighter jet. First of all, it's difficult to hit a moving target. Secondly, you normally do that with a pretty big bomb, and this doesn't look like the work of a big bomb. It leads you, therefore, down the path. This was probably some form of armored drone that normally has somebody guiding it and controlling it with a camera so they can see where it's going. So although what we know is that these people have died, if you look at the evidence on the ground, it looks like 3 very specifically targeted events which the Israelis have admitted they've done.
Okay, if we assume then they are targeted, can we just stretch this out a bit and explore at least a couple of other reasons why this might have happened? So I gather, and you'll know much better than me, if you're going after value targets in your enemy, a low value target, you wouldn't permit much collateral damage, to use that awful term. High value targets, you might bomb a whole building to take them out, knowing that civilians are going to go as well. So one possibility, which I've heard, floated in the media, is that Israel actually thought there was a very high value target amongst that convoy, and therefore actually deliberately took them out.
One of the things we'll never know is that these vehicles were probably driving at fair speed. They were driving at night. They were driving in a war zone in a rural area. Now, they're meant to have been coordinated with the Israeli Defense Force, but the convoys, I spent 2 years in Afghanistan, and when we did any work around aid workers, it was not that difficult to provide secure environment for the aid workers. The trouble is they didn't want to be operating closely with the military because that actually stopped them doing the aid work. They were seen as being part of the problem, not part of the solution. So there's always a bit of friction between the two. Now, so it's quite possible that the aid convoys, big trucks, tons and tons of aid, were well coordinated. Day's end, finished, going home at the end. Is there the same level of security around? Was there a degree of complacency? Apparently these guys were part of a security, guys and at least one female involved, but the 3 British males were all either ex-military or part of the security detail. So you'd imagine that they'd be pretty alert to the risks involved here. So there's a lot of questions I think it leaves unanswered.
I'll give you one more.
Go on, shoot.
Again, it's out there. I don't know what to think about it, but Hamas have given us no evidence that they actually care for the people of Gaza. Their money's gone into building tunnels. They've definitely created their infrastructure in and amongst civilian buildings and territory. And that makes fighting, dangerous for everybody. So another possibility is that to gain publicity, Hamas have been prepared to sacrifice their own. And they could maybe concoct a situation where this looks like a value target, but actually turns out not to be. And what we get is something that could actually bring down a lot of support for Israel in the West. That would be, this is war. That would be a big win for Hamas.
Yeah, and I think there's always going to be room for lots of Machiavellian theories. I think on this particular example, the only Palestinian in the group was the driver, who I understand was quite well known to the charity organisation. So it would be quite difficult, I think, for that cover story to work in this particular example. But there's been lots of examples in Gaza where there's been a suspicion, and that's why one of the reasons why the IDF have tried to operate so carefully. But what was fascinating about this particular one is that very quickly the IDF said, we need to review this carefully. And within hours, Netanyahu was admitting that it was a mistake. What the long-term implications of this are, goodness knows, because when you're putting aid to convoys, if you've got military personnel around it, military vehicles are easily identifiable. Also, they have secure communications so that you can make sure that you can coordinate with anything that's going to target you. And thirdly, you've got electronic means to identify friend and foe. as soon as they're not there, and you're talking about vehicles, there was a lot of talk about, this logo had lots of World Central Kitchen logos all over it. At night time, really difficult to see. A lot of these vehicles are covered in mud anyway when they're driving around. And I'm not making excuses. I'm just saying, as a former pilot, if some of these things seem obvious when you're on the ground, they're less obvious from the air. But it was a tragic mistake. And the harsh reality of this one is that aid is desperately needed in Gaza at the moment. What's happened is a lot of these ships, one of the ships, I think it's 240 tons of aid, has been turned back now from Gaza, heading back to Cyprus, because the aid agency want a degree of reassurance that this is not going to happen again. So whatever the outcome of the investigation, what's actually happened is, once again, it's the Palestinians who are suffering on the ground, and aid is not getting through despite the best efforts of the international community.
So that's clear, whatever we think. The question is, Israel obviously, and have admitted, did the bombing or whatever the thing was that took them out. I guess the big question is, who is the real culprit? And all I'm saying is, out there in the media, there's a view that the culprit could be Israel, for reasons you've said. The culprit could be Hamas, because we know in wartime, you lead your enemy a merry dance and make them go after the wrong targets by giving them false signals. All I'm saying is, anything ultimately could be possible.
And I'm with you. I think we covered this a little bit on Sky yesterday. And one of the interesting parts of the discussion is that we had all these conversations on the table. The trouble is that there is so much, you're either for us or against us with this whole Israel. We talked about this on the podcast before. And the danger is that whilst it's possible that Hamas were responsible for this, those who believe that the media and we are simply providing a pro-Israel narrative here would say that, wouldn't you? What I'm trying to do, and I think we tried to do in Sky yesterday, and we're trying to do today, is to go, there's lots of explanations that might be possible, but the most likely, there's a puppy here and a pile of puppy poo. This is most likely a tragic mistake. Israel's have fronted up. For me, the real concern, though, is that it was 3 separate strikes. This wasn't just one mistake. How on earth can an aid organisation that is trusted by the Israelis somehow find itself with 6 of its workers and a Palestinian driver killed in what seems to be a totally avoidable incident?